Hey, it's Tucker. I travel a lot and I start to notice how the smallest rushed decisions can turn risky fast. From a man who refused to pay for a bathroom and found himself at the edge of a dangerous cliff, to a woman who showed up to a New Year's celebration with no idea that a single spark would send the night spiraling. These are the most disturbing tourist deaths ever recorded. It was June 14th, 2016, and the Atlantic wind was already running hard off the water by mid-morning. The cliffs of Moher had seen enough of these days to be indifferent to them. The path was busy, the barriers were where they had always been, and somewhere along the western edge, a sequence of small, ordinary decisions was already in motion. Ronald Hadid was 30, a software engineer from Boise who colleagues said had recently received a raise and had developed a pattern of spending that they found difficult to reconcile with his personality. He would drop several $100s on a flight upgrade, then spend 20 minutes disputing a parking charge. When he reached the visitor center and saw the €2 restroom fee, he walked back out. I can't help but recognize that contradiction because I've caught myself doing the same thing, being irrationally stubborn over something small while ignoring much bigger costs. According to his friend, the fee was not the issue, exactly. It was the principle of it, or what he had decided the principle was. He had paid for the site entry. He had paid for the flight, the rental car, the hotel. He might have thought that €2 for a bathroom felt like an insult layered on top of everything else. He also appeared increasingly focused on avoiding crowd flow around the main viewing points, occasionally shifting position as if looking for clearer sight lines or a less obstructed photo angle. He walked back toward the cliff path. A couple from Cork later told investigators they had noticed him near the barrier, scanning the cliff edge. The warning signs along that section were posted at regular intervals. The waist-high stone barrier was a mix of metal fencing reinforced with stone wall sections, and clearly posted warning signage, and it was continuous and clearly intentional. A few nearby visitors glanced in his direction, but no one engaged him directly as he stepped over it anyway, moving onto a narrow grass shelf that angled toward the ocean, damp from overnight rain and flattened in patches where others had apparently done the same thing before him. A German tourist standing roughly 40 feet away on the designated path watched him position himself near the edge and briefly shifted her attention back and forth between him and the path traffic without intervening. When Ronald finished and turned back toward the barrier, he did not test his footing. He turned the way a person turns on solid ground, casually, shifting his weight without checking what was underneath it. His right foot came down on a patch of compressed, rain-soaked topsoil at the upper edge of the slope. The soil did not hold. His foot slid outward and his weight followed it. According to the witness, he did not fall immediately. He staggered backward one step and then another, his arms coming out to the sides. His heel dug in and the ground gave way in a clump. He went down onto his back. The slope behind him ran at roughly 40 to 45 degrees, but was broken by irregular rock steps and uneven ledges that offered no consistent footing or traction before steepening further toward the edge. He began sliding. The German tourist later said it lasted longer than she expected. She saw Ronald trying to stop himself. His hands were pressing into the ground, fingers dragging through the topsoil, pulling up loose clumps of grass and dirt that came away without resistance. His elbows found nothing solid. He shouted once. The witnesses on the path heard it clearly over the wind. Approximately 20 feet down, his left shoulder struck a rock outcrop embedded in the slope. The impact was audible. It rotated him sideways, and that rotation eliminated the last of the friction his body had been generating against the incline. He accelerated, the remaining distance to the edge covered in seconds. 2 witnesses contacted emergency services within 2 minutes. Cliff rescue personnel reached the top access point, but terrain and wind conditions along the base delayed recovery for several hours. His body was located that afternoon during a weather window, clearly dead. The drop was approximately 700 feet. The coroner's findings noted catastrophic blunt force trauma consistent with a fall from extreme height. Local coverage was brief. Officials noted the barrier had been clearly crossed. I see this whole incident as completely avoidable. Every step that led here was a choice, and none of them were forced. This next one genuinely sat with me for a while. It's about a 70-year-old man who flew to Prague alone, and nothing was his fault. It was October 3rd, 2017, and Prague's residential districts had already gone quiet by the time the last tram of the evening made its rounds. Something irreversible was already moving toward a man who had come here carrying grief. Marek Iliev was 72, Bulgarian-born, and had spent the better part of 4 decades building a quiet life in Ontario, Canada, with his wife Vera. Vera had died more than a month before this trip. Their kids said that she had grown up in Prague, had spoken about it often in the way people speak about places that formed them before life redirected them elsewhere, and Marek had apparently promised that he would go with her. He came alone. He carried a small shoulder bag with a city map, a phrase book, a wallet containing the equivalent of roughly $60 in Czech currency, and a photograph. Multiple CCTV captured him walking the streets. He had not joined a tour group or hired a guide. One of his kids said that he probably took the tram because Vera had taken trams as a child. By 11:40 p.m., he was waiting at a lightly trafficked stop in a residential district. The nearest pedestrians, a couple standing on the opposite sidewalk perhaps 50 feet away. 4 teenagers arrived at the stop sometime around 11:45. The couple noted that the approach looked ordinary at first, loose, unhurried, the body language of boredom rather than intent. One asked Marek something. He shook his head. Another spoke. He shook his head again and shifted his weight, pulling his shoulder bag slightly forward against his body and angling himself toward the tram track as though checking for a light in the distance. I can see how easy it is to misread this kind of approach, because nothing here immediately signals danger. The group did not leave. One moved to his left, another positioned behind him. The couple across the street had not yet determined that what they were watching was anything other than a conversation. Marek attempted to step around the teenager directly in front of him. The teenager did not move. What followed took less than 20 seconds. One of the teens grabbed the bag strap and pulled. Marek pulled back, not violently, but with the full resistance of someone who understood that the bag was not the only thing at stake. A second teen pushed him from behind, not hard, but enough to compress the space between him and the shelter wall. The couple later said they had begun moving toward the curb at this point, not yet running, still uncertain. Then one of them later described seeing a brief arm movement. The knife entered Marek's lower chest on the left side. The teen's hand was at his own hip height. Witnesses described the motion as brief and retracted almost immediately, like something involuntary. Marek did not shout. He absorbed the impact against the shelter wall, and the group separated from him in the same instant, moving fast up the connecting street and out of sight with the bag. For 2 or 3 seconds, Marek remained upright, his right hand pressed flat against his lower chest, his left arm extended slightly toward the shelter rail. Blood had already soaked through his shirt in a dark, widening patch. He took 1 step forward. Then his knees went and he came down sideways onto the pavement, landing on his hip and shoulder, his head contacting the concrete with a sound the couple across the street recalled as a sharp impact, rather than clearly identifying it with precision in the moment. They reached him within 30 seconds. He was conscious. His eyes were open and tracking. He moved his lips twice without producing words. And then his breathing changed, audible, labored, inconsistent, and he stopped attempting to speak. Both witnesses called emergency services simultaneously. First responders arrived in approximately 7 minutes, but Marek was unresponsive when they reached him. Resuscitation was attempted on scene. He was pronounced dead before transport. The coroner identified the cause of death as acute hemorrhagic shock resulting from a single penetrating stab wound to the lower left thoracic region. Because the 3 younger suspects were 14 years old, they were below the age of criminal responsibility under Czech law. The case was handled through juvenile courts and child protection services, where protective and corrective measures were applied instead of standard criminal prosecution. This next one is a completely different situation. A backpacker in the Philippines who was warned more than once by the exact people he was riding with. It was May 9th, 2015, on a provincial road cutting through the interior of Sorsogon in the southern tip of Luzon, Philippines. The road had been repaired and repatched so many times that it no longer resembled its original surface. I can't ignore how this already feels like a setup for failure. When infrastructure is this compromised, I see every vehicle on it as one bad bounce away from disaster. Noah Doppler was 26, originally from Hamburg, and had been moving through Southeast Asia for 11 weeks on a budget that required constant compromise. He kept a travel account with modest reach, and among the small rotating community of hostel guests who crossed paths with him across Cebu and Leyte, he had developed a reputation for treating the local commute as his go-to mode of transportation. The jeepney he boarded outside a wet market that afternoon was already carrying more passengers than its interior bench seating could accommodate. Several individuals were standing near the open rear entrance, gripping the overhead bar as the vehicle moved. Noah positioned himself on the exterior rear step, a narrow metal ledge roughly 4 inches deep, and took hold of the handrail with his right hand. The driver, through a rearview mirror exchange, indicated he should move inside. A seated passenger near the rear opening gestured the same. Noah acknowledged both and did not move. His bag was slung across his left shoulder, and his left hand was occupied holding his phone. His reasoning, as later described by fellow travelers and hostile contacts who had shared segments of his route with him, followed a pattern. Local passengers rode this way routinely, the distance was short, and the alternative was pressing himself into an already compressed interior. The provincial road between the market and the next town was surfaced in asphalt that had been patched repeatedly over flood-damaged substrate, leaving the lane riddled with shallow depressions and several potholes deep enough to jar vehicle axles through the chassis. At this point, I'm thinking the environment alone should have overridden any sense of normalcy. Traffic behind the jeepney was close, a small delivery truck following at a distance consistent with normal provincial road spacing, where gaps close faster than urban drivers expect. The jeepney driver maintained speed through the rough stretch rather than slowing abruptly, likely avoiding a sudden brake that could have caused the vehicle behind to close in too quickly, with no clear shoulder available to ease into. Witnesses seated inside described the ride as rough but unremarkable, until the rear axle dropped into a pothole measuring, by later road authority estimate, roughly 4 inches in depth. The vehicle lurched downward and snapped back upward in a motion that registered as a single violent pulse through the frame. Inside, standing passengers staggered and collided with one another. At the rear step, Noah's grip released. Witnesses at the open entrance said it happened before anyone could process it. One moment he was there, the next the step was empty. He landed on his right side and shoulder on the asphalt, his body angled across the road's travel lane. The delivery truck behind was approximately 40 feet away when he hit the ground. The driver applied heavy braking under uneven traction conditions caused by the patched surface and load shift, producing a sustained scraping that lasted several seconds. The vehicle's forward momentum carried Noah beneath the front axle in an underride impact, and the truck came to a full stop only after traveling several more feet, leaving him pinned beneath the forward section of the chassis. The jeepney had continued forward several yards before stopping. Passengers from both vehicles and roadside vendors reached Noah within approximately 90 seconds. He was conscious briefly, showing limited movement in his upper body, then stopped responding. Roadside vendors and jeepney passengers called for emergency services immediately. Responders from the nearest rural health unit arrived and took him to the clinic, where he died moments later. The truck driver was initially investigated for reckless imprudence, but ultimately not charged after authorities concluded that braking distance and road conditions made avoidance impossible once the fall occurred. The jeepney operator received an administrative citation for overcapacity. Personally, I agree with that outcome. Once he fell, it feels like physics took over more than human decision-making. The next story features a lady who managed an allergy for years, and this time, it just went differently. It was September 22, 2014, in Rome's Centro Storico. By the end of that evening, a small family-run restaurant off a side street in the historic quarter would be the site of something that doesn't look like a catastrophe until it already is. Alex Pulpe was 34, a freelance graphic designer from Budapest who had spent the better part of that September moving through Europe with a loose itinerary and no fixed return date. She had left Hungary following a difficult breakup and what people close to her described as a sustained period of professional and personal exhaustion. The trip was deliberate, a reset. She had a severe allergy to tree nuts diagnosed in childhood and had managed it carefully for most of her adult life. However, sometime in the weeks before Rome, she had misplaced her EpiPen. She had not replaced it, a decision her travel companion later said that she was prioritizing the travel budget over the expensive EpiPen. "I can't overlook this. If I had a life-threatening allergy, I'd see an EpiPen as non-negotiable." That evening, she and her companion had chosen the restaurant based on proximity and a recommendation. It was busy, but not overwhelmed. A single server managing most of the floor. When the dessert menu came, Alex asked directly whether a particular item contained nuts. The question was genuine and specific from her side. The server, working in a second language under a full section, understood the concern to mean peanuts, a common interpretation in contexts where nut allergies are raised casually. He confirmed the dish was safe. He believed that to be true. The dessert arrived without visible nuts, without any smell or surface detail that would have suggested a problem to someone sitting across a candlelit table. She ate several bites. Within a few minutes, Alex set her fork down. Her companion noticed her coughing, not the kind that draws a room's attention, but persistent, returning after each pause. She swallowed repeatedly, visibly, and stopped talking mid-sentence. A family at the adjacent table later described watching her touch the base of her throat and shift in her chair. Her lips, one of them noted, appeared slightly thickened. Her voice, when she spoke again, had a strained, effortful quality that hadn't been there before. She pushed her chair back and raised her hand toward the staff. By that point, her breathing had become audible at close range, a shallow, wheezing rhythm that her companion immediately recognized as wrong. A server reached the table within seconds. Water was brought. Another staff member moved to the back, and a quick check for any available epinephrine injector among staff or nearby patrons was attempted, but none was present. The companion began explaining the allergy, using the word anaphylaxis, while Alex sat forward with both forearms on the table, trying to keep her airway open through posture. Her coordination was already declining. She was having difficulty tracking the conversation around her. Staff called emergency services and relayed a suspected severe allergic reaction. A worker kept one hand on Alex's back to prevent her from pitching forward. Her responses to direct questions, "Are you with me? Can you hear me?" slowed and then stopped. She leaned into the chair. Then she slumped. Response units arrived approximately 11 minutes after the call. Paramedics initiated resuscitation on scene. Alex Pulpe was pronounced dead shortly after. Toxicology and food investigation later identified the dessert as containing a hazelnut praline and almond flour base incorporated into the tart crust, ingredients not listed on the menu and not visibly identifiable in the finished presentation. The case was ultimately classified as an accidental death with no criminal charges filed, though documentation noted regulatory concerns regarding allergen communication reliability. I think it's a stark reminder that when risks are well known, overlooking even one layer of protection can have irreversible consequences. Now, just like Alex, this guy knew the risk going in. He just decided it didn't apply to him. It was August 11th, 2018, and the mid-morning heat over a commercial strip in Seminyak, Bali, had already settled into the kind of weight that makes everything feel slightly slower than it should, except for the traffic, which did not slow for anything. Brenton Langford was 22 and had grown up in the outer suburbs of Perth, the kind of upbringing where family vacations meant the coast 2 hours south, not international departures. This was his first trip abroad without his parents, booked on a budget airline ticket he had saved for over 8 months while working shifts at a hardware warehouse. He had told friends he wanted to do it properly, independently, without a tour group telling him where to stand. He had been in Bali for 3 days and had photographed temples, eaten from street carts, and by all accounts been exactly the kind of traveler he had set out to be. He had no motorcycle license. The scooter rental was a quick, informal roadside transaction common in that part of Bali. Cash paid, a passport photo taken as collateral, a key and helmet offered, and no formal paperwork, license check, or safety briefing required. Brenton had likely watched enough other tourists on scooters over 3 days to conclude it was manageable. When the vendor pointed toward a row of helmets hanging from a rope along the wall, Brenton declined. I think this is where the system quietly fails people. Normalization of unsafe rentals makes bad decisions feel routine instead of dangerous. What he did not account for was the intersection approximately 1.2 miles from the rental point, a 4-way crossing fed by a high-volume road where the light cycle was short and aggressive, and where the outer lane edges had accumulated a mix of loose gravel, sand, and residual road dust, with traces of oil from heavy traffic runoff pushed there by rain runoff and traffic displacement. The surface was not visibly compromised. It looked uniformly patched despite subtle uneven texture under glare from midday sun. He reached the intersection as the light turned yellow. Witnesses on the near curb and on adjacent scooters described him accelerating slightly rather than slowing, a decision consistent with someone still calibrating the unfamiliar controls and uncertain which choice was safer. He was mid-intersection when he registered cross traffic beginning to move on the perpendicular road. He applied the front brake sharply. A rider stopped at the adjacent lane described both hearing and seeing the front tire begin to skid almost at the same moment. A short, flat loss of traction sound on pavement that changed pitch as it crossed into the gravel margin. The front wheels stopped rotating while the scooter's momentum continued forward, and the bike slid laterally out from under him in a motion that took under a second. He went over the handlebars. His trajectory was forward and low, and his hands began to extend reflexively but did not fully absorb the impact before his head contacted the road surface first, followed by his chest. The impact was audible to witnesses within 20 feet. He came to rest in the adjacent lane. A truck traveling the crossroad had already entered the intersection. The driver braked and pulled the wheel left, but the vehicle's stopping distance at that speed made full avoidance impossible. The front right side of the truck passed over his lower legs. Brenton was not unconscious immediately. Witnesses described small, disorganized movements, a hand shifting, his head turning slightly, over a period of roughly 30 seconds. Then he was still. One bystander reached him first and did not attempt to move him. Several others were already on their phones. Medical personnel confirmed fatal head trauma at the scene. In the following days, enforcement along the rental strip did not observably change. Brenton's family flew to Bali 5 days later to bring him home. The entire incident sits in a frustrating pattern for me. Predictable risk, minimal prevention, and then procedural responses that don't actually change behavior on the ground. All right, this last one is almost hard to believe. She wasn't doing anything extreme, wasn't chasing a thrill, wasn't even the one taking the risk. She was just standing there. It was January 1st, 2013, and the beach in Rio de Janeiro had already swallowed what felt like the entire city by the time midnight closed in. White-clad bodies pressed shoulder to shoulder across kilometers of sand. The water lit intermittently by aerial shells detonating offshore, the air carrying the sulfur residue of 1,000 smaller charges already spent. Camila Duarte was 28 and had flown in from Lisbon 4 days earlier to spend the new year with 2 friends. Her friends later described her as cautious in crowds, someone who preferred standing back rather than pressing forward. She had positioned herself roughly 30 feet from the water, far enough from the surf line to stay dry, close enough to see the offshore display clearly. She had been standing in the same spot for nearly an hour. I think her positioning makes sense on paper, but I personally wouldn't trust safe distance in a situation where unpredictable pyrotechnics are being handled by strangers. The group to her left, 6 or 7 people, appearing to be in their early 20s, had been setting off consumer fireworks intermittently since around 11 p.m. They were working from a plastic bag of assorted shells, using a series of cardboard launch tubes propped upright by hand or wedged into the sand. Witnesses in the immediate area later described the setup as casual and disorganized, with tubes repositioned several times throughout the evening. Beach security patrols had already moved through that section earlier in the night, issuing warnings about ground fireworks, and had briefly paused near similar groups. But the density of the crowd prevented sustained enforcement. At some point in the final half hour before midnight, one tube came to rest at a visible tilt, leaning at an angle that anyone standing nearby could observe. Partially buried and unsupported on the softer, wind-loosened sand near the group's feet. Several people in the surrounding area noticed it. A woman standing approximately 10 feet away later told investigators she had looked at it and thought about saying something, then turned back toward the water. As midnight passed and the offshore display intensified, the group began lighting their remaining shells in quick succession. The tilted tube was among the last to be ignited. A person at the edge of the group crouched and held a lighter to the fuse. The fuse caught and burned down within 2 to 3 seconds. The shell did not go up. It left the tube nearly parallel to the ground, moving at speed through the lower air column, head height for most adults standing in the area. Witnesses described it as a streak of orange-white light moving horizontally through the crowd, very fast, with a hissing report that cut briefly through the ambient noise before anyone had time to process what they were seeing. The crowd in its path had no meaningful interval to react. People who saw it coming from the side described it lasting less than a second from emergence to impact. It struck Camilla in the upper torso. Witnesses placed the contact point at the chest and left shoulder region. The initial impact knocked her straight back, her body moving as a single unit without any catching motion, feet leaving the sand before she was fully down. The detonation followed immediately on contact. Witnesses closest to her described a sharp, percussive concussion they felt in their chests, rather than simply heard, followed by a flash at torso level. Several people within a 15-foot radius were thrown off balance or knocked down by the pressure. A man standing roughly 6 feet to her right sustained minor burns to his forearm. After the blast, the crowd in the immediate area scattered outward, then stopped. A few people moved toward her cautiously, covering their mouths. She was on her back and showed no purposeful movement. One of her friends, who had been standing several feet away, reached her first. A man nearby used his phone to call emergency services within 2 minutes of the incident. Witnesses noted that while emergency units were staged in the broader area, reaching the exact location required navigating dense, slow-moving foot traffic. Resuscitation efforts were initiated on scene, but to no avail. The coroner's report identified the cause of death as blunt force and blast trauma to the thoracic cavity, including catastrophic damage to the lungs and major vascular structures of the upper chest, with secondary burns consistent with direct contact detonation. Death was determined to have occurred at or near the point of impact. No criminal charges were filed. The group responsible had dispersed in the immediate aftermath, and identification efforts were inconclusive due to the size and movement of the crowd. The lack of accountability combined with predictable safety messaging afterward is a pattern I personally find frustrating. It reads like repetition without real behavioral change.